Hello, Digby.
Hi, Focus. You okay?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
Good, not too bad, thank you. So, I've made you a co-host. I think that enables you to do anything you need.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So, we'll just keep ourselves quiet till 7 o'clock, right?
That sounds good to me. I'll
Okay.
see you then, Digby.
See you in a bit. Yeah.
So Digby, it looks like we've got about 17 people here at the moment. I think the final count on Meetup was around 35. Are you happy to start at 7 on the dot, or would you like to wait a little while?
Well, maybe we give it a couple of minutes, Fergus, and then we can kick off.
Right.
My experience is people always come 2 minutes after you start, whenever you start.
I think that's true.
But good evening to those people who are here. Thanks for coming to this SOP meeting. We have a new chair tonight, Fergus Evans, and you're vice chair of the organisation now, aren't you?
Vice chair, yeah. So this is the first event I'm hosting. So for those of you who are very used to Ruth's kind face, I hope you'll allow me some grace while I get used to hosting an SOP event. This is a first one I've hosted, though I've attended quite a few.
Right. Yeah. Well, we're very pleased to have you in this position.
Well, thank you.
Help Ruth out a bit. She's been carrying that burden for a while. Well, not maybe a burden exactly, but having to turn up every SOP meeting.
Well, certainly very helpful to have you as the lecturer for tonight's session, as it's the first one I've hosted. So hopefully you'll be kinder to me than the average speaker.
Right. Well, maybe we should kick off. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think we've got a good chunk of people here. I'm also keeping an eye on the meetup just in case anyone's having any difficulties getting into the meeting. But yeah, if we get started. As Digby said, first of all, I just wanted to say hello and introduce myself. My name's Fergus. I'm the vice chair of the Society of Psychotherapy. Welcome to tonight's event. For those of you who this might be your first event with Society of Psychotherapy, I thought it might be useful just to have a quick description of who we are. So we're an organization. We're really here to create a meeting place for folks with an interest in psychotherapy to come together and to share ideas across discipline, across modality. And so it is a very exciting opportunity to have Digby speaking to us tonight. Digby obviously has a very long history with the Society of Psychotherapy. He founded the society with Emmy van Derzen. In addition to that, Digby is a current treasurer, so still very, very much involved in the organization, and is the deputy principal of the New School of Psychotherapy and Counselling, located in London. Digby is also an emeritus professor of psychiatry at the University of Sheffield and a visiting professor of psychology at Middlesex University. He trained as a group analyst, a cognitive behavioral therapist, a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, and an existential analyst. So pretty much all of the disciplines available. I think you've got all of the Boy Scout badges, Digby.
I couldn't make up my mind, Fergus.
Exactly.
Finally, I found a calm waters in existential therapy. So
amazing. Well, Digby, I shall hand over to you then. So Digby will be speaking to us about sex and love. He'll do a presentation, but there will be an opportunity for questions and discussion at the end. So as and when anything occurs to you, please do feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll look at those at the end once Digby is finished. Is that right, Digby?
Thank you very much, Fergus. So hi to everyone. I thought I'd choose an easy subject tonight, which was not very controversial. So let's hope it goes that way. I'm going to switch straight into my slides and let's go for it. Okay, so just a quick definition. So we use sex in lots of different ways. One is perhaps the origins really is something about attributes that differentiate two types of individual vertebrates, including humans. I say vertebrates because, of course, there are males and females of many other orders and phyla even. There are male and female trees, of course, but it has a quite different interpretation. So I'm not going to be using sex to mean this tonight. Then, of course, there's the second use, which has become incredibly controversial, which is the idea that sex and gender are the same thing. Of course, now it's widely recognized that gender is culturally or socially determined, perhaps less widely agreed that it's individually determined, although there are many people now who claim that's the case. And there are third sexes, and indeed people would argue that they'd have no sex there, or no gender rather, non-binary. And of course, there are cis and trans gender identities. I'm not going to talk about gender hardly at all, thank goodness, because it's a subject filled with controversy, and I hope we can reach some sort of measure of agreement tonight. So I'm going to be talking mainly about sex, which is an activity usually involving stimulation of the body, particularly in the genital, or not solely in the genital area. So I'm inevitably going to be relying on some generalizations, and it's important to note that all generalizations are false. So I'm really hampered at the beginning with something that is actually completely illogical, but most of us would probably agree that sex is in itself illogical, or at least doesn't fit with predictability or rigidity, so that's okay. But just bear in mind that I will say things that somebody will think false, and they may well be right. But we need to start somewhere. So sex has multiple uses. Sex in the sense of sexual activity, erotic activity, you might say. It's quite important to human beings because we probably wouldn't survive without it, unless we had a very large number of scientists who are able to carry on the human race with artificial insemination or other kinds of in vitro implantation. We would die out. Perhaps more important in the sense that that doesn't seem to be happening very in the near future, it's a very important source of reward. We get a lot of pleasure and satisfaction from sex, and I'm going to argue that even love can originate in sex. Why is that? Well, it creates relationships. People who have sex with each other often have a more lasting relationship, and indeed some people would argue that's perhaps the reason for sex, above and beyond its biological importance. And sex may also create emotional closeness between the people who have it, but not necessarily. I should say that much of what I'm going to say doesn't differentiate between different sexualities. So what I'm saying, I hope, doesn't necessarily assume heterosexuality or heterosexual expression. Obviously, this particular slide does assume that there are at least two people, but of course also we may be talking about more than two people if one has faith in polyamory as a form of closeness. And I'm not saying one thing and another. So mainly I'm going to be talking tonight about what fills in the gap between sex and love. Of course, I'm going to have to try and define love. And again, my definition of love might not be yours, but as Fergus said, there will be an opportunity to discuss, I hope. So what does fill in the gap? Well, it's probably, or I'm going to argue, it's desire. This is a sculpture by Rodin called I Am Beautiful. So I picked it because it's the kind of epitome of desire, and it's not particularly gendered either. So I thought we could all appreciate that. One difficulty about the subject, of the many I've already alluded to, is that we are deceived about it. We deceive ourselves. We try and deceive others. We boast about it, or we minimize our sexual activity. And that makes it almost impossible, really, to know what is typical. I think this is quite an important point, because as psychotherapists, for those of you who are psychotherapists, sexuality is often seen as a particularly important aspect of relationship and life satisfaction. So if we don't really know much about the sexual experiences of our clients, it's quite hard to know enough about the mainsprings of this important activity. So, and I think we just have to assume that we can't be entirely sure, and that our clients don't particularly want us to know in detail about their sexual activity. But of course, people may be more likely to bring it and discuss it if they feel it's problematic. And I suppose at the end of the day, that's what matters. Just a couple of examples of self-deception in sexuality, just to kind of give you an idea of what I mean. So women view femininity as a sexually desirable characteristic to men. But it turns out that actually that's not what men value. And men think that women value social and financial power or status, but that turns out to be not what women value either. So both of these genders go through life being, as a generalization, for which there are probably many, many exceptions, believing something false about what is sexually desirable to the other gender. Another one, which is a bit more problematic, came from yet another student survey, in which people were interested in what kind of sex their students had. Most of them were women because they were studying sex, and apparently that shows a preponderance of women in American sexuality courses. So out of the 1155 students, 77 said they'd never had sex with another person, but they did say they'd had oral genital contact. So the authors took this as a kind of self-deception. I'm not sure it is. I mean, who's to say that oral genital contact is sex? Because none of us really, quite sure what sex constitutes. Maybe it's just like kissing somebody. Is that sex? I don't know. But anyway, kind of interesting that if you ask people about sex, you have to be really clear about what you're actually asking. This is from another paper in which somebody was looking at what they called relationship work in sexual intimacy in long-term heterosexual and LGBTQ partnerships. It was in Current Sociology, so quite a good paper. And they conclude, the article, they found that people who are in LGBTQ relationships, partnerships, are more, what shall I say, diverse in their sexual practices, and are more open about that, more willing to talk about it. I assume that's what reflexivity refers to here. So, and they say that's a good thing because it shows how people who don't have to abide by normative sexual scripts, such as queer couples, they say, assuming they don't, can more readily manage sexual discrepancies. So what are these sexual scripts? I think they're very important. One script is genetic, supposedly, in that there is a strong school of thought that says we're basically just driven by our genes, and that it's the genes that tell us how often to have sex or even who we have sex with, and there's an end to it. And that's had quite a strong following for a long time, but particularly nowadays, because people often make the argument that, for example, inside their real self is different from their biological self. But there are a whole bunch of cultural scripts which I think are even more important. Of course, one, which we're all aware of, is incest. But there are other scripts driven, for example, by childcare. Now, early on there's been several studies of medieval sexual practices and developing religious and ethical criteria for proper sexual expression. And one of them, or a bunch of them, seem particularly to center on the idea that it's very important to have a mother and a father who stay together throughout the life of the child. So a lot of our ideas about unfaithfulness and about fidelity and so on come from this period. It was, of course, fired up also by the idea that sex is bad, something that originated possibly with St. Paul, but was given a big push by St. Augustine of Hippo. So how much of that these scripts linger in us, I suppose, depends on our own religious upbringing and our own acculturation and so on. But of course, there are scripts about contamination. We'll talk about that in a bit, which drive sexual prejudice against particular cultural groups. And then, of course, there's a very big one about reproduction. Now, many of us have got the idea that since reliable contraception was introduced, reproduction is a choice. It's not a consequence of having sex. So whether or not we have reproductive sex isn't an issue anymore. We can have enjoyable sex without worrying about reproduction. So we'll look at that in a moment. Infection is another script. You might think that's biological, but actually most people's ideas of infection or sexual infection are pretty culturally determined. They come from hearsay and so on. But of course, that's a very important one because of not just because of HIV, but because of human papillomavirus, rising levels of antibiotic resistance, gonococcal infections, and so on and so forth. Recovery of syphilis as a significant source of infection, viruses, and so, I don't need to go into all of them. We're probably only too aware of them. But another big issue about all of this is inheritance. The whole idea of bastardy came about because people didn't want to see their property split, and they developed all sorts of complicated rules about who you can have sex with, because that means who you can reproduce with, in order to maintain these complicated rules. And of course, well, anyway, we won't go into that. So is reproduction off the table as a consequence of sex? Well, apparently, according to the Health Education England, a third of births in Britain are unplanned or ambivalent. So a third of people having babies weren't really entirely sure that's what they wanted to get out of sex. one issue, it'll come up again and again, is that men want to have as much sex as possible and women don't. They want to have planned sex. Again, there's got a slide about that in a bit. But actually the impact on women of reproduction is quite significant. It's not just childcare, it's obstetric complications, it's having poorer antenatal care because people go for their antenatal care later, it's depression. And then when it comes to the children, unplanned or unwanted pregnancies are associated with lower birth weights, and that is associated with mental and physical ill health and less well performing in cognitive testing. Now, of course, we're not talking here about really massive effects. It's not like, you know, your 19th century parent might have told you you must never think of having a child until you got married and you're in a proper family and so on. One strange thing about these discussions about sex is that we often refer to animals in telling us how we should ethically behave. The natural argument is often put forward. Certain things are unnatural and therefore assumed to be bad. And there's a kind of backlash. So there's a very well-known primatologist called Duval, I've forgotten his first name, who works in the Yerkes primatology lab. And he's just published a book about bonobos, which is his interesting, his topic of interest, who, as you may know, pygmy chimpanzees, so-called. They live on the other side of the Congo River to ordinary chimpanzees and are something, well, have almost all our genes, and those of the chimpanzee cousins, brothers and sisters, whatever you call. So he says, you could call bonobos Kama Sutra apes who moat in every conceivable posture, including some that we are incapable of, such as hanging upside down by their feet. They, of course, can do lots of things hanging up down by their feet, not just sex, but that's by the by. So female bonobos get enormous pleasure from their sexual activities. I'm not quite sure how that conclusion was arrived at, but I guess he's spent a lot of time watching bonobos, so he probably knows. And they masturbate. Now, this was reviewed in the Times Literary Supplement this year at the end of April by Carol Tavris, who she reviewed another book with a similar tenor, and she felt that this was a triumphant claim for women's desire and their sexual expression, and that it was all down to men and a kind of conspiracy for men, of men, to deny women their proper expression of desire, because after all, we're all very similar to bonobos. This is the kind of animal, so making judgments from animal observations that really, I guess most of us should have become a bit skeptical about, particularly following the rise and fall of evolutionary psychology. Tavris was wanting to contrast this very liberated and up-to-date view of animals with a guy called Bateman, who was looking at Drosophila and concluded that females would be choosy and reticent to make sure they conceive with the best quality males. So that was an expression of the other idea about women, that women are very careful and guarded with whom they mate, and that rules their desire. I, of course, am not a woman, you probably noticed that, and I wouldn't dream of specifying how women are or I just put these bits of evidence in front of you for you to comment on, maybe. It is true that women have higher sexual satisfaction if they are with men with similarly high sexual satisfaction. And it's a bit disturbing that if that fails, they're happier if the man has higher sexual satisfaction than they do. That does seem to, rather than they having higher sexual satisfaction from the men. So that does seem to suggest there's something a bit different about female desire. But as I say, I'm not going to want to pontificate about it. Why can't we argue from bonobos? Well, bonobos have estrus. I think it's once a year, I'm not sure. Of course, human beings can be fertile on any day between the menarche and the menopause. So it's a bit of a different thing, being able to accommodate lots of different male apes, as Duval has observed bonobos do, if they only have to go through that once a year. Of course, men have lots of views traditionally on what women's desire is like. There's the concept that women are either Madonnas or whores, very well-known idea, but kind of brought out in pubs all over the country on a regular basis, I think. There's certainly a view that women's sexual pleasure is socially very dangerous. So we all know about circumcision or excision. There's the idea the hymen belongs not to the woman, but to her father, or perhaps her husband, and therefore it has to remain intact until one of these men choose to break through. Hymen being both membrane and also the god of marriage, the Greeks. So I guess this hymeneal idea was around for a long time. Of course, one reason that women might be dangerous is because their womb has a tendency to wander about. And so hysteria is, or was thought to be, a particularly female attribute. Personally, I think I've seen more hysterical men than I've seen hysterical women in my career, but obviously that's a bit, probably because I've seen more men than women. And it's generally supposed that women really shouldn't show a lot of desire. Although actually in couples, when you ask them, when, at least that's true of Hong Kong, when a sample were asked in Hong Kong, men thought it was great when women asked for sex. But maybe it's different in other parts of the world. Simone de Beauvoir was, of course, very sharp about all of this, very sharp about the control of women by men, got into trouble with later feminists because she didn't see any way around it. She thought there was no way out. This is one of the quotes from The Second Sex. The young girl feels that her body is getting away from her. On the street, men follow her with their eyes and comment on her anatomy. She would like to be invisible. It frightens her to become flesh and to show flesh. Of course, now it's much less common to hear men whistling at women in the street, but it's not unheard of, I don't think. And there are, of course, gazes and so on, even touches on tubes and so on that reinforce this idea that a woman is somehow like a prey for some men. So what about male desire? Well, there is a kind of battle about who controls reproduction. So various kinds of animals have developed, males of those animals develop ways of keeping other men out of the situation. They don't have cultural control the way human beings do. So they use mating plugs to bung the woman up, or in this case, the female fruit fly up, or they have toxic semen. This garish picture here is an electron micrograph of a seed beetle penis. So the idea of the seed beetle is to shove his penis in and then destroy the vagina of his sexual partner as much as possible so that she can't take in another male. All of that, so of course his semen, his sperm, is the one that impregnates, that results in conception. Mice have an even more nicer way of doing things. If a pregnant mice meets a new male mouse and has sex, her body resorbs the fetus and makes way for a new fetus. But having said that, it's actually, giving these examples makes it much too, they're so selective, it makes it much too like a one-way street. So somebody looked at hedge sparrows and counted the number of male hedge sparrows that the females mated with, and found that in one season she might have up to 50 mates. In fact, birds often have eggs that are produced by several males. So they quite sensibly really capitalize on genetic diversity and kind of put their bets on several squares. There is an idea, perhaps more prevalent among women, I don't know. Again, I don't want to talk about the opposite gender, that men aspire to being wolves. So it's again an animal image. I don't even know if wolves are particularly sexually incontinent. So what makes a man a wolf? Well, of course, there is the idea that men like to tell other men about what they've achieved, and sexual achievement is counted in the number of women that have welcomed you into their bed, apparently, supposedly. So that's called having a notch on your belt. How often that actually happens, I don't know. It suggests a rather limited group of people. Belt wearers, I suppose, aren't widely distributed in the population, and those that are don't notch their belts very often. But anyway, oops, sorry. Then there's some idea that men are more interested in having sex with lots of women. There's a study in Norway that's just this year that seems to suggest that is perhaps true. Interestingly, women like to have sex in unusual places more than men do. So I'm not sure what that means. Then there's a kind of evolutionary psychology idea that it made a lot of sense. So that men went around distributing their copious sperm all over the place, and women tried very hard to prevent that from happening to them. But so wolves made sense to evolutionary psychologists. But I suppose the most common or the most lasting idea is that wolves are created by desire. Some people maybe seem to have a lot of desire for sex, other people less. And as if we've seen, there's some suggestion that men more often have desire for sex than women. Now, I take it that, some of my audience might believe Duval's bonobo story and say that's just another way in which men are trying to suppress women's expressiveness and their power. So I don't want to put a lot of emphasis on that. So what about desire? Well, if you want to know about desire, you can always look at the Pornhub annual review. That tells you something not very useful about the kinds of porn that people like to see, but it doesn't seem to have much relationship, I don't think, to sex in the real world. But one interesting thing about this year's Pornhub review, which I looked at purely for scientific data, I have to say, is that there was an outage, apparently, I didn't know this, of both Facebook and Instagram. And at those times, many more people used Pornhub. So either people just have to have something on their screen, which is colorful, or somehow even Pornhub, with its apparent distasteful absence of sexual relationship, somehow creates the illusion of relationship even so. So if people can't feel in relationship with others through Facebook, they turn to Pornhub. Now, I know that there are many other alternative explanations of that, and you may well have ones that are more plausible yourself. So how big is a driver is desire? Well, some good people at the University College London sent out a regular survey to, I think, about 1,000 or 2,000 people, asking about people's sexual activity. Now, of course, that's different from Pornhub, which isn't about sex between people, it's just about fantasy. So this is about actual sexual activity, which may or may not be more accurate. So 37% of men and 44% of women between 16 and 24 had sex more often than 5 times a month. So slightly older men, between 34 and 40%, and 40, sorry, that should say, aged 40, nearly half of them nearly a half of men between 25 and 34 had sex at least 5 times a month, and 40% of women. So women tend to have sex more often earlier than men. And these figures probably fit most closely to the proportions of, to the demographics of stable couples or partnerships. Now, there would have been, these aren't necessarily cis men and cis women, or not necessarily heterosexual men and women, but I would suspect these figures are predominantly biased by cisgender heteronormative couples. Desire goes down quite heavily later in life. You might think you knew this already. It's stuff of kind of, novels and everything. So just be pleased that you got it right. It is true. And it's particularly true of women. In fact, about a half of women over the age of 65 don't have sex at all and lose a desire for sex with their partners. There's a similar, but not quite so steep fall with age in men, but men are more likely to increase in masturbation. So we think of masturbation as being associated with young adolescents, but apparently not. And older men start to fear not being able to satisfy their partners. So kind of sad sacks, really. About 1 in 5 people use phosphodiesterase type 5 inhibitors like Viagra. And that's slightly more true of gay men and women. So why do we need to know this? Well, of course we don't. It's just, I think, somehow important, even when we're focusing on the meaning of sex, which I tend to go on to know what the underlying facts of people's sexual behavior is, in as much as you can get facts, of course. So, moving on to desire. What's the connection between love and desire? So I didn't want to kind of pontificate about this. So it was great to find a qualitative study that looked at 31 women, 10 of them bisexual, 8 lesbian, and the remainder heterosexual. They have a wide age range, 20 to 69, and they use thematic analysis, which is a kind of pretty standard qualitative method, as you know. And they found that there are 4 main themes that for these women connected love and desire. First of all, they weren't connected. They were separate experiences, these women said, but they did fuel one another somehow. So there was a kind of almost metaphysical connection. And they were also intertwined in some way. And if you were fortunate enough to encounter love, then that somehow enfolded or encompassed desire. And my reading around this subject, which has mainly been for a book chapter, for a book called Eros and Psyche, which is due to be published in the States next year, not edited by other people, is that love and desire do have these kinds of connections. So let's move on to talking about desire. I just want to introduce the idea of emotional flavor briefly. This is something that I first introduced in a couple of papers and in this book. I'm pleased to say this book hasn't actually been remaindered, but you'd be hard put to find it probably. Well, actually, I think you can still probably buy it, but you know, it's not exactly lying around in every good bookshop. So the best example of emotional flavor is this very famous example taken from Swann's Way by Proust, which he called the Madeleine example. Apparently it happened actually with rusks. He dipped a rusk in real life in tea, and that flavor and the smell of the rusk impregnated with tea brought back a tremendous flood of memory from his childhood. And it was on the basis of that recovery of his memory and his reading of psychoanalysis at the time that proved the stimulus for him to write In Remembrance of Time Past. You know, his very famous multi-volume book. Actually, he did mention another kind of stimulus. This was camellia. So in, I think, Swann's Way, in Swann's affair with Odette, the first time they made love was in a carriage and she was wearing a camellia. Or maybe he was, I can't remember. But it was very fashionable to wear a white camellia. And so when he wanted sex from her in the future, he was a modest sort of chap. He'd say, "Can we do a camellia?" So the camellia stood for sex. Now, not quite as strongly as the Madeleine or the rusk. And what I argued in my book is that some things get impregnated with memory, with the affect around a particular experience. And that re-experiencing those things, particularly in the form of smells, throws us back into that same affective state, often associated with a strong memory where the affect was first created, but not always, because the affect evolves, because as we re-experience it, so it changes, because the emotional experience or the emotional state we're in when we re-experience it also impregnates it. So desire, sexual desire, has an enormously powerful Madeleine-like effect. It throws us back into a state of suddenly sometimes of past experience, of intense memory. And it becomes associated sometimes with its own trigger, such as a camellia or a particular gesture or a particular, even a certain quality of the sky and the light. I'm going to call that glamour. So desire evokes a glamour. And here are two examples of glamour. One is associated with people. This is a Met. This is the ball at the Met this year. People dressed up. So from Vogue. So, and somebody has the good fortune to be wearing a new engagement ring. So that adds to the glamour. As you can see, these ladies are full of glamour. The erotic nature of glamour here isn't quite, and its desirous nature isn't quite obvious, although this is perhaps on the right, this is perhaps the most famous glamour photo of all time. And not to say it's the only kind of glamour, but just I had to choose something. So that's creates the same impression, but in a more eroticized way. This is the hero glamour. It's a particular kind of motorbike. So I just wanted to put that in to say glamour doesn't necessarily always pertain to bodies and isn't always eroticized. The person who thought up this idea is Walter Scott. Glamour was a Scots word that he introduced into English. He was, of course, the quintessence of the romantic novelist of his time. So this tapped into an idea of romance and sublimity. It's actually a corruption of the word grammar. And grammar itself means, of course, somebody who can read and write. And because that was so unusual, it came to mean somebody who was a bit too clever by half, a bit dangerous because they were too clever. So there was a link with witchcraft, and Scott saw glamour as being a kind of witchcraft. I like the dog. I can't remember who did this picture, but I've got it somewhere. So if anybody wants to know, I can tell them. He worked himself to death, poor chap, wrote so much. So one of the great examples of glamour is in a novella by Søren Kierkegaard called Diary of a Seducer. It forms part of it's usually part of a much larger publication called Either Or. And the interesting thing about it, it typifies what Kierkegaard thought was the aesthetic life, which he was repelled by. It's also, as often people have said, somehow about his falling in love with a woman called, now I've forgotten her name, I always do that, Regina Olsen, and casting her off in a very brusque way because he was so upset about it all. So this is what the author, the supposed author of a diary that is the basis of a Diary of a Seducer. And he's on his way to his girlfriend, or Cordelia, he's been seducing. We have a modern nasty word about that, grooming over a period of time. And this is how he describes what he's experiencing, which is, I think, the quintessence of the glamour of desire. Who I am is irrelevant. Everything finite and temporal is forgotten. Only the eternal remains. The power of erotic love, its longing, its bliss. Now, of course, he hasn't actually got there yet. So what he says on his way back in the carriage is, but now it is finished, and I never want to see her again. For when a girl has given away everything, she is weak. Now all resistance is impossible. And to love is beautiful only if resistance is present. As soon as it ceases, to love is weakness and habit. So I guess that's what girls, at least of that time, of Cordelia's class, were really pretty upset about. They would be, as she would have said, probably compromised. And Kierkegaard thinks a bit about what it is to live the aesthetic life, to constantly go up and down in this way. He thinks that you'd have to constantly try and arouse your desire in order to give yourself pleasure. Listening to opera was one way of doing that, he thought. He himself particularly liked Don Juan and wrote sort of glowingly about it, and Mozart. But you're constantly riding this kind of up and down seesaw, because the desire fades, just like happiness, it goes away. So living the ascetic life was not, he thought, a sensible thing. Now, of course, there have been other philosophical defenses of the ascetic life, the Cyrenaics, for example, and the hedonists, possibly, and the Epicureans, but that's not for today. But there's another problem about getting close to people. However much you're driven on by this terrific fog of excitement and longing and idealization and imagining that the person you're in love with is uniquely and solely capable of arousing this kind of feeling in you. And you know, of course, that should she cast you off, or should he cast you off, or reject you in some way, even momentarily, there is a terrific downside. But poor old Sartre had a bigger problem, which is that the closer he got to somebody, even physically, the more a kind of revulsion, the nausea that he writes about, grew in him. And this rather awful sentiment is what he put right at the end of Being in Time. Slime, this is the translator's word, he didn't quite call it slime. Slime is the revenge of the in itself, a sickly sweet feminine revenge, which would be symbolized on another level by the quality sugary. He then goes on about holes and then finally passes explicitly onto sexuality. And then he talks about the obscenity of the female sex, which is that of everything which gapes open. So that's kind of sad, isn't it? It's as if somehow he just couldn't overcome the fact of bodies. He didn't like his own, I don't think. And he clearly didn't like other people's. He doesn't write anywhere that I know of what he thinks of the male body, but I can't help thinking that he might have just as much terror and disgust about the male body. So it becomes quite important to differentiate between love and lust, certainly if you don't want to be compromised, because love carries with it some kind of promise of permanence or stability, which lust clearly doesn't. We've put a lot of emphasis on this, don't we? I mean, we tell people off, our friends, if we think that they're allowing lust to control their actions. The BBC website, quite unexpectedly, had a story this year or this week called What's the Difference Between Love and Lust? It's had 4 million views in 2 days. So clearly this is still a big issue. Of course, we might have people we lust for and people we love, or we might be quite capable of keeping the people who we lust for to a controlled level and so on. I'm not saying it's either or necessarily. People manage their love lives in complicated ways, and I would have some data on that if we had more time, but I don't. We don't. But why does it matter? You see, if we were just as Carol Tavris was thinking, you know, like the bonobos, we can just have a good time, even if we're hanging upside down from a branch. Why should it matter that we differentiate between love and lust? Well, it clearly does matter, because clearly love is something more important. And I'm going to end the talk by trying to say a little bit about my views about that. But I might just mention there's some interesting studies of hookup culture, which is just, you know, saying, do anything tonight, why don't we have sex? And then, you know, on the way to the gym or something. And okay, that's fine. But it turns out that even for men, there is a lingering hope that a hookup might turn into something more. And quite a substantial proportion of women, maybe 40%, who consented to a hookup. So again, this sample is from American students and so on, might be quite different elsewhere. but something like 40% of women the day after a hookup think that wasn't quite as good as I thought it was going to be, and maybe I don't really know why I bothered. There are, of course, plenty of pop science explanations of what love is. So here is what the BBC said in that clip. Love starts with attraction, so that you need, they say, testosterone and estrogen for that, or androgen and estrogen. Actually, androgen seem to what make women have sexual desire as well as men. So it's obviously going to be a lot more complicated than that, they say, as everything in endocrinology is. Then they say it's all about dopamine, and that's what gets you addicted to another person. Well, okay, dopamine is increased when you're on a gambling habit or when you're doing anything really, when you're using cocaine. So that's a kind of pseudo explanation. There are upwards of 50 different transmitters in the brain, probably more than I'd ask. Look, why single out the same old ones? I don't know. So then they say adrenaline, well, that's a big part of it, because that explains why you get dry mouth, or maybe that's noradrenaline. It explains the excitement somehow. Does it explain the excitement? Not really. If you gave people adrenaline, does that mean they say, oh yes, I'm sexually excited? No. If you give people adrenaline, it depends on the context, how they interpret it. It's a study done in 1951. And then of course, the poor old bonding hormone gets drawn in, the thing that makes sheep and their lambs bond. But, you know, so they mentioned vasopressin too, which actually, at least in some animal models, makes animals aggressive. So all of these things are terribly oversimplified. The best thing though is to think that there do seem to be stages. So another popular model is that it all starts with arousal and desire, which is about saying, oh yes, she's the one or he's the one. It's about, and they say some people would say that's somehow picking the right genetic match. There's stuff about, people smelling like your father, HeLa cell match compatibility and things like that. Okay, it would be interesting if that were true. And then there's the addiction phase, which everybody seems to agree with, which is a bit like this desire, the glamour that you get caught up in. But as we've seen, that's pretty easily ended. And then there's a phase which I do believe in quite strongly, which is about falling out of love. So suddenly finding you're not so happy with the other person. Where do you go from there? As I think Emmy will have heard me say, my father got slapped with a tea towel by my mother once when they were washing up. And it's that, he said, that convinced him he would propose. And there is a kind of fork in the road, isn't it? It's about negativity and incorporating negativity. And then people say there's a fourth stage called true love or bonding, which is where oxytocin comes in. So all of this is a terrible oversimplification, and I certainly can't summarize anything to satisfy you, I'm sure, in a short time. But it does seem that love involves some kind of binding together. It might be shared projects. It might be, both being fierce archaeologists and spending your best holidays on digs in, somewhere. It might be children, it might be dogs, but desire is perhaps the most common, I think, sexual desire, the most common binding force. The fact that young couples do live together in a shared glamour. Now, of course, that's very different from the glamour that Kierkegaard described, which wasn't shared. That was like throwing a net or a spell on somebody else and hoping it sticks. So sharing is a big part of love. And I would say love is always developing, or at least changing. It never stops. There's never a point where you can say, okay, now we've got there. This is true love. Great. Now I can knock off and think about the garden. So it's not exactly like a developmental process, but it is a developing process, round and round, up and down. The management of negativity seems very important in love. That's something that the married couple, the Gottmans, have been working on for years and years and give master classes on and so on. Because it's important stability. It seems hard for couples, even with a very large infusion of positivity, to manage negativity. Negativity tends to triumph, although you can sometimes pull it off by having enormous quantities of positivity there. But generally, quieter emotions, I think, are very important in love. Tenderness doesn't necessarily involve full-fledged sex, and tact are very important. And all of this is part of a project of seeing the other person as they are and not trying to make them different. Very hard to do, because we all have an idea of what our other ideal person should be like, very strong ideas sometimes, and they're so deeply embedded that sometimes we don't even realize that we're making that assumption. We just assume that other people, well, that's how they should be. But then there's another thing, which is about valuing otherness in the same way that one learns about one's own difference. It takes a long time to realize what an odd person each of us is. It's kind of nice, but it's also disturbing to discover that there are people who think one's very strange or one's very defective in the world. And to come to terms with that is quite striking. But to come to terms with the fact that another person is maybe more valuable because of that otherness is also, I think, a part of loving. Now, as I say, I'm not saying these are necessarily linear processes. Maybe you get to this point on a Monday afternoon, and maybe on a Tuesday, you're back at this point, management of negativity. Perhaps those processes deepen, perhaps they get less fierce, but I think desire helps us with all of those processes, because like poor old Sartre, desire involves plunging oneself into otherness, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and so on. So I think desire remains an important aspect of relationships, although, of course, it's not essential, and it's, you know, I don't want to generalize for everybody. So there we are. Those are my superficial thoughts about sex and love, and I would very much like to hear other people's corrections, amendments, and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Digby. I'm sure loads of folks have loads of thoughts, because that was such a comprehensive presentation. I was really struck by how much you were trying to grapple with, you know, these complex concepts and how much there is. So I had this kind of sense throughout the evening of having all of these avenues we could have disappeared down. So for folks, please do feel free to drop any comments or questions, any thoughts into the chat, or, you know, do feel free to raise your hand on Zoom or in the video, though I'm just aware of how many people we have in attendance. So if I don't call on you, it's probably because I haven't seen you. But Digby, one of the things that I was thinking about, you know, one thing that really came through for me is a kind of the kind of humor with which you held these scripts that we inherit about what love is, what desire is. And I had a real sense of you wanting us to hold those scripts lightly. And I was wondering, in working with a client, if the client really ascribes is very closely aligned to a script, a cultural script around desire, around intimacy, around love, and it seems to be causing them distress, but perhaps they're not aware of the ways in which this script is causing them distress. How might you work with the client to kind of draw their attention to the fact that they're working to a script?
Well, I suppose I start from the assumption we're all more actors of a cultural script that we've been handed than we would like to believe. So that perhaps the issue for me very often with clients or with supervisees and their clients would be, are we sufficiently aware of their the constraints they experience around themselves? I suppose the second thing is that, like with a play, you know, very different scripts seem to make just as good plays. So it's important, I think, to set aside one's own scripts to a great and be open to the way in which people are playing out their lives. So more often than not, as you know, we as therapists just sometimes reflect on where this could be going for you with clients, rather than saying, oh no, that's not good, or that's, because what none of us realize sometimes is where that script is going, where that project is going to end up. So sometimes we might ask people that, and sometimes they'd be quite happy with that conclusion, and sometimes quite surprised, I don't know. But I suppose for me, at the back of it all, there is a kind of wonderment. And, you know, when you realize, you know, when you read somebody who says, this is how sex is, or this is how it should be, they're taking away some of that wonderment of the very different ways that people can be. And regrettably, I think prejudice about, you know, gender prejudice or about sexuality prejudice can, you know, restrict our wonderment. To be fair, I think to somebody who, you know, sometimes thinks they're a little bit too non-diverse, you can only take a certain amount of wonder before you start to feel you're kind of going to explode with the wonder of it all, can't you? But, you know, you can take more and more with little steps. So I know Emmy will be listening thinking he does answer questions far too long. So I'm sorry about that. And I'll stop, but I hope I've at least answered some of what you were asking me.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I've ever heard the kind of phenomenological project described as wonderment before. I don't know if that's exactly what you meant, but it feels like there's a link between that one of the ways in which we can approach phenomenology is with that sense of wonder, with that sense of real curiosity and amazement. And I'm just thinking, yeah, what a beautiful.
I don't know how it is for you as a therapist. I have good weeks and bad weeks. So a bad week, I think, oh no, not more complexity, please. I'm not sure I can handle this, and I'm not very receptive. So it's only on a good week that I have this wonderment reaction, when I suppose I'm feeling a bit more stable or secure myself. But yeah, I think a lot of what we do as therapists, a lot of the privilege of being a therapist is to be given that opportunity to wonder. You know, astronomers can peer at distant galaxies and have a kind of wow feeling when they realize that this galaxy is actually redshifted, so it's, you know, X billion light years away. We don't have that, but we can have the same kind of wonderment when we come across yet another way of being a human being and having a good life.
Absolutely. And how the ways in which we encourage our clients to have that same kind of wonderment, that part of the project is encouraging them to have that same approach to their own lives and the lives of people around us. Lots of questions coming in for you, Digby. So if we start, David Solomon has asked, is it necessary to fall out of love, or may we remain in bliss eternally?
Well, you probably are going to tell me, Reem, that you have remained in bliss eternally, and all I can say is congratulations, and that must be wonderful. But the Gottmans I mentioned, John, and I've forgotten his wife's name, did some very important, I think, studies of marital stability or couple stability, I think. And the trajectory, never a cross word, was very unusual. But there were some couples who had just never had a cross word. And I guess they didn't need to fall out of love. But the commonest trajectory was a bit of positivity and a bit of negativity. And as long as the positivity outweighed the negativity and people could get back on track, that was okay. So I don't think it involves falling out of love, because one's lives after quite a short while get so entangled and enmeshed that you can't bear to think that you're going to have to pull yourselves apart. So, but there are times when you really wish things were happier, I guess, or you're really upset with something another person has done and you can't quite bring yourself to forgive them at that moment. And I think for most couples, or at least the Gottmans found that, most couples did have moments like that. And if they got it right, it actually sometimes solved issues or deepened the relationship. But it's not absolutely essential. So other couples didn't, unusually. So there's another question about love language. No.
There's quite a few questions, actually.
Oh, okay.
Just before that,
which I shall answer then.
Sorry, Digby. Yes, so Leora, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, asked quite a direct message. Does love actually exist?
That's the question that Prince Charles asked, wasn't it, when he was married to Princess Di? But he hasn't, I don't think, asked it since he remarried. So I would say, I would say yes, but I think you don't know it exists until you've actually found it for yourself. Not that there's a particular way of finding it, or it's like, a particular thing you find, but there is a moment, I suppose, when you stop asking yourself, does love exist? That's the answer.
So something about the experience of it, the discovery of it, kind of proves its existence.
It's hard to say, isn't it, Fergus? Because there's kind of there are no rules or anything. It's just about, just about thinking that you'd stumbled on something that just is amazing, could only be what people call love,
Yeah, there's something about the ineffableness of love, but also one of the things I really enjoyed about your presentation tonight, Digby, is how much space you give us in sort of reminding us that there are no rules about love. It's very difficult to kind of describe what love is or how one might find love, but rather a sort of sense of it is an act of discovering for oneself what love might be, or ways in which we have experienced love.
But it would be awful to imagine, I don't know how many pop songs are about love. How important is it to our popular culture around the world? So many, we want to sing when we want to talk about it, or want to express it. So I think, our human existence would be immeasurably poorer without love, even if we had as much sex as the bonobos.
Some other questions coming in. Thank you, everyone who's submitted these. So please do keep on submitting questions. Reem has asked, has said thank you for the presentation, and says I can't help but think about love and trauma or love and abuse. And I think that's one point, and then there's a kind of second question, which is another wondering is more about the 5 love languages and what your take on them might be. So that kind of, I can't remember the name of the writer who published that book on 5 love languages, but words of affirmation, quality time, physical touch, acts of service, receiving or giving of gifts. So something about quite a formalized model by which we recognize that people experience and express love in different ways, and if there's a mismatch between those experiences and expressions, sometimes that love isn't seen or felt or received. So two very different questions or provocations. I wonder which strikes you.
Okay. I should probably have said something about giving time and touch, because both of those, giving people time is actually like a kind of psychological touch, isn't it? And a touch obviously is a very important aspect of communion, true of bonobos. In fact, maybe that's what sex is as much as anything to bonobos. And if we were going to talk about hormones, very much involved with opioid endorphin production. So yeah, I think touch is very important. And it changes the relationship, doesn't it, when you touch somebody in a remarkable way. So yes, I should have said something about that. The interesting point about trauma, I guess there is a feeling that trauma can prevent people from trusting another person or trusting a situation enough to allow that that some of the early elements of love to develop. But I don't know, love finds its way somehow, doesn't it? I wouldn't like to generalize about trauma or abuse and love. I don't know. I used to see quite a few people in the past who self-harmed, and they were often traumatized, but somehow they were able, some of them, to find love and found partners who were extraordinarily loving, given their the provocations that they sometimes had to deal with. So I wouldn't want to say one precludes the other, but clearly trauma or abuse make social relationships, especially emotionally significant relationships, very difficult and rocky. There's another question here about autism.
Yeah, so Cameron has asked. So Cameron says, Digby, I'm wondering about linking your other specialism, autism, with tonight's theme of love, and wonder, a bit of a fun question. Does the hyperfocus and enduring interest of the autistic person, which can be far more intense and immersive than neurotypicals, allow the autistic person to love more deeply, more enduringly than neurotypicals?
Well, it's certainly the case that having autism doesn't stop you loving somebody. One problem that people with autism have is that they can fall in love very deeply, and that can be with people who can't possibly reciprocate, and that can lead to problems. But if a person with autism is lucky enough to meet somebody who fits, who can somehow empathize with their autism and see some, value in it, I think those relationships can be very, very stable. Unfortunately, I mean, there are lots of rocks sometimes when people with autism feel they can't disclose their autism, and they go through a conventional courtship, and then they find that their partner hasn't expected to confront difficulties like never having their birthday remembered or things like that. And that can be a difficulty. But these days, I think people are more willing to disclose their autism in that kind of courtship. and it can work okay. I'm not sure it's about hyper-focus, because people falling in love are pretty hyper-focused as it is, aren't they? You don't think of much else other than the loved or the desired person at that point. You don't know whether you're going to love them, but you certainly desire them at that point. And that can conflict and interrupt all sorts of things you're doing. So I think that, you know, that's when we all share that same capacity for hyperfocus, isn't it?
I am some more questions coming through, but I'm going to use my prerogative as the host to ask you a question that's been sitting with me, Digby. And I was surprised that it didn't come up in the presentation, which is something around endings. I know that you talked about the process of falling out of love as being, you know, potentially a feature of relationships. But I was thinking, if we take this kind of existential given of death, of endings, how that may or may not impact our ideas about love and desire. Just wondering if that came up when you were putting together the presentation.
Well,
right.
Endings that are between two living people in a relationship are, as we all know, incredibly painful. And the more we are in love, the more we're shocked and devastated and so on when those happen. Endings when another person dies are different, aren't they? If you're in love with that person, a lot of people will say things like, I can't wait to rejoin her, or I can't wait to. So we have a perception that the other person, because they're loved, lives on in some way, in some, you know, insubstantial realm where we could join them. And even very rational people are inclined not to question that assumption. So that kind of ending can be terrible, but also contain a kind of hope in it. And, you know, if you have loved somebody, you can feel, I guess, a continuing fortune that you've had that experience in your life, because you know that not everybody will. So I think Freud got it right in Mourning and Melancholia, that it's when you don't have love that it's harder to mourn somebody. But when you do, and there's, you know, that continuing respect and devotion, you know, maybe it's going to the grave once a week and tidying it up, or maybe it's, I don't know, taking up the hobby that your partner used to have and pursuing it, or whatever it is, so that they remain alive for you. And you don't need them to remain alive for anybody else. They can just remain alive for you. And I mean, there are all the losses. There's the cold bed, and there's the, you know, everything like that. But there's also something that I think can persist in that situation. I hope so, anyway.
Yeah, we've got a bit more time, so please do keep the questions coming in, but I'm going to ask a bit of a follow-up, Digby. I'm curious, for those of us who are therapists, who are working with clients, particularly those who are kind of existentially minded, I'm thinking I might be misreading, and I'm aware that Emmy's here, so I'm sure she can speak up and tell me if I'm misreading her work. But one of the things it feels that Emmy calls us as existentialists to do is to kind of bring death into the room, to bring endings into our work with clients, and to be fully prepared to have those conversations with our clients, to not allow it to be a taboo subject. And I'm thinking in terms of working with clients in relationship, whether that's, you know, the people, more than one person as the clients in relationship, or one person who is coming to us with problems around the relationships. How might we bring in the possibility of the end of a relationship, the end of a romantic relationship, because it feels so taboo to talk about divorce, endings, breakups, death, bereavement? Is that something that you work with in your work with clients at all?
Well, I have done, And I think that situation is terribly hard, and it's like a little death. I think the problem, though, is somebody who can't accept it. So the relationship has ended, but they have a hope that it will rekindle, or because they feel it was so unjust it ended, they feel they can sort of claim it should start again in some way. Or so I think it then becomes one of the broad categories of people who can't accept the turn that reality has taken. It's too painful. And of course, that's a very common problem for all of us to work with as psychotherapists. It's a common theme in a lot of our psychotherapy problems. And it involves us being their companion as they try and find a way through something that they feel is too scary to enter, the acceptance that actually it is over. So, but I noticed, can I pick up another question, a broad question that David Solomon has asked? Did you ever conclude that love is a human raison d'etre? Yes, I did.
Is that why you wanted to pick up that question, Digby? Because it was easily answered.
Well, he asked, yes, that's the answer I did, yeah. I mean, it's when I was asked when I was in group therapy as part of my group analytic training, my therapist, and I had my wife had my first child, and the therapist asked me, "What's it like?" And I said, "Well, nothing's changed at all, but it's just like we used to have a black and white television, and now we have a color television." So I would say love, obviously it brings pleasure and happiness and contentment and safety and security, but it also brings a dimension that just wasn't there before somehow. I suppose you could say it's a spiritual dimension. It's something that puts you to your test. You have to, it gives you a challenge. Are you worthy of this love? Can you rise to meet it? But I don't think it's something you can put into words, but I do assume it's something quintessentially human. I don't think bonobos probably do feel it. I mean, of course, they get attached, I'm sure, to other bonobos and all that stuff. But there's something about the imagination, the music, the sense, the narrative, all those quintessentially human things that attach to love, I think, that do make it, well, not exactly a raison d'etre, but something that makes it worth being human rather than a bonobo. Even if you can hang upside down by your toes, which I always thought would be rather cool.
Absolutely agreed. Lots of thank yous coming through, Digby, just to let you know, lots of people. Carolina said, beautiful sharing how love influences all aspects of life and the meaning of touch, tenderness, bonding. Thank you very much, Digby. So many people coming through to say thank you for the presentation. We do probably have time for one or two questions if anyone has been holding off and would like to ask a question. It looks like we've just had one through from Pauline. So Pauline has said, following on from the question about love and trauma, don't you think that certain attachment styles, often stemming from traumatic experiences, can make falling in love and forming a stable relationship more difficult? I know people with such a past who tend to engage with quite rocky relationships or casual sex, but struggle to function in peaceful, loving relationships.
Yeah, I think I said something similar to that. The difference between what you said, Pauline, and what I would say is I don't think one needs to assume that there's something called an attachment style, that interpose between being traumatized and having this difficulty in relationships. I don't really believe in attachment styles or personalities or things like that. And I don't think we really need them. We just use them to make ourselves feel as if we have some knowledge, which we don't. But I agree with you, absolutely. Obviously, it's trust and sort of a basic feeling of security. And of course, if people lose that in the course of their lives, if, for example, they're raped or they have some terrible experience, perhaps some of these poor guys in Ukraine who are on the front line, they might find it quite difficult to come home and love in the same way that they were able to love before. They might desperately feel they needed it, but it might be difficult. So they're going to have to face an uphill struggle, I think, some of them.
One of the things that really struck me, Digby, about your answer earlier as well was this kind of a reminder to us that folks who have experienced trauma, that trauma doesn't necessarily mean that folks will experience difficulty in forming loving relationships. That absolutely there can be a correlation, but it's not a one-to-one that folks who experience trauma. Yeah. Yes, exactly.
We all have a choice, however hard it is or slim it is. Yeah.
Yeah. And on that note, I think there's not much else, just to say thank you to everyone who came along tonight. We really appreciate it. Please do, you'll probably get a reminder from Meetup to rate the event, to let us know what you think. So please do, that's really useful for us to know what you thought of the event. And also just to say our next event will be coming up on the 21st of June. So please keep an eye on the Meetup page. We'll be announcing the new speaker shortly. And then finally, just to say thank you so much to Digby for tonight's presentation, for presenting such a...
Thank you to Lucas for doing a great job of chairing, and thank you for the very interesting questions and engagement from the audience. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah. Bye.